Have you ever felt lost or confused inside a movie or a book? You get to the end and you're like, I didn't like it, but I'm not really sure why. There was just something off about it. There's a good chance that the writer messed up the genre conventions. This is a common problem. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through what genre conventions are, why you have to have them in the story, and how you can use them to write a unique and innovative story. My name is Tim Grahl. I'm the CEO of StoryGrid, and I've been working with writers for over 15 years. My partner, Sean Coyne, is the creator and founder of StoryGrid and a writer and editor with over 30 years of experience. Imagine you woke up in a room with no memory of how you got there. So you start looking around, trying to figure out where you are and what's going on. The first thing you see is this adjustable table with like a thin sheet of paper across it. Then you look on the wall and there's all of these anatomy posters of the inside of the human body. Then you look around some more and you see one of those blood pressure machines. You see one of those little things that people look in your eye with and in your ear with. And then the door opens and this guy walks in and he's got a white lab coat on and he's got a stethoscope around his neck. At this point, you've probably figured out you're in a doctor's office. But what if instead, when you were looking around the room and the door opened, a guy walks in with a bowler hat on, a trench coat, and he's got a lit cigarette in his mouth? That's going to feel a little weird. You were thinking you were in a doctor's office, but the wrong person walked in. Or maybe you see all the same stuff on the walls and you see that same table, but it's got plush white carpet on the floor. You're going to start feeling off. You're going to start thinking something is up with this doctor's office. There's something wrong with what's going on here. This is how I need you to think about genre conventions. So let me give you the definition of what a genre convention is, then we'll dive into the different types and look at some examples and how you can apply them in your writing. Genre conventions are the familiar elements or rules that define a type of story. They help writers know what to include and readers know what to expect. Each genre has its own set of conventions. So genre conventions are things that must be in the story when you're telling a story inside that genre. Otherwise, readers are going to get confused, they're going to get annoyed, they're going to get lost. Inside of genre conventions, there are two types. The first is selective constraints. Imagine you go to a play and you're looking up at the stage. That is the selective constraints. You see how big the stage is, you see some initial set pieces, you see the curtains, you see the sandbox, the place where this story is going to be told. The second thing is enabling constraints. These are things that have to be on stage. So these are the characters in the story, different tools that show up, different things to come about to set up what this story is and what you can expect. Now, at this point, we've talked a lot about genre conventions, and you may be wondering, what exactly is genre? It is not all of those links that you see on the side of Amazon or the big signs over the bookshelves at your favorite bookstore. Genre has a very specific meaning. It's about the value at stake. I'm not going to go into it right now because I did a whole video on that already. So if you want to clearly understand genre, maybe for the first time in your life, click on the link down in the description and go watch my video on genre. But in this video, we're talking about conventions. We're talking about the things your story has to have in order for your reader to enjoy your story. Let's look at some examples of each of these categories. First, we're going to look at selective constraints. These are the conventions that set the stage for the story. So inside the action genre, for a movie like The Martian, you have to have an intense setting. So the setting must be disturbed and unbalanced because this is where the conflict arises. So inside of The Martian, of course, he's all by himself on Mars, so that's a pretty intense setting. Another example might be The Deadline. There is a clock that establishes a limited time in which the protagonist must act. So inside The Martian, he's going to run out of food and he's going to die if he doesn't get rescued. An example of a selective constraint from horror would be The Labyrinth. This is where settings are claustrophobic and they conceal dangers. So inside a horror story like The Shining, the hotel itself is this huge sprawling place with rooms and hallways, and of course, there's that famous hedge maze out front. A selective constraint from the love genre would be an external need. There must be something outside the romance that is driving the actions of the main characters. In a story like Pride and Prejudice, there is this social pressure that people find somebody and get married whether they're in love or not. If we look at the war genre, a selective constraint would be overwhelming odds. So the protagonists are substantially outnumbered, and we see this in a story like Saving Private Ryan, where there's this huge war going on and the odds of them tracking down this one person and saving them are really small. So there's lots of different selective constraints depending on the genre that you're telling a story in, but these are examples of what it means to set the stage for your genre. Let's look at some enabling constraints. If we look at crime stories, there has to be an investigator. Someone has to take on the responsibility to solve the crime. In a story like Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie, we see that that's Hercule Poirot. That is her detective that solves the crimes. Another enabling constraint inside of crime would be red herrings. These are false clues that mislead the investigator. If we look at a performance story like Whiplash or Rocky, we have the conventions of training. So we watch as the protagonist must practice and practice to gain or recover the skills necessary to perform. Another enabling constraint inside of a performance story would be the strong mentor figure. This is the archetypal character that challenges and guides the protagonist as they train and level up. If we go back to the horror story, an enabling constraint is that the monster can't be reasoned with. So this is not a typical villain from other genres. Inside of the horror story, the villain is just something that wants to devour and annihilate. You can't sit down and have a conversation with the monster. And again, we see this show up in The Shining, where there's never an opportunity to reason with the monster. The monster is just there to destroy. So these are some examples of both selective and enabling constraints from lots of different genres. If you want to dive into the individual genres, we have lots of resources walking you through the genre conventions for each of the genres down in the description of this video. But at this point, you may be wondering, well, how do I use these genre conventions inside of my story? So I'm telling a love story or a horror story or crime story. I can get these list of conventions. That's great. Now what do I do? Well, first you use it as a checklist. You have to have these conventions in your story in order for your story to work. Now, a lot of times when I talk about genre conventions, I get pushback, and the pushback sounds like, well, this is just a formula for a story. Won't this make my story feel formulaic or predictable or cliché? In fact, it's going to do the opposite. First of all, like I've said over and over, if you don't have these in your story's just not going to work. Your reader's going to get lost. They're going to get confused. They're not going to like your story by the end of it. That's assuming they even get to the end of it because it's missing conventions. And actually, this brings us to the second way to use genre conventions. These are the places that you can innovate. These are your opportunities to actually create a unique story. Think about if you were making a cake. There are unlimited number of recipes for cakes. There are unlimited ways to innovate and make new variations of cakes. In fact, we see these showing up on the internet over and over and over. So there's all these different ways that you can make a cake. And yet, no matter how many different ways there is to make a cake, you know it's not a lasagna, right? A lasagna is a completely different thing that also has to have certain things in order to make it a lasagna, or it's not a lasagna anymore. This is the same way when we're talking about genre conventions. You have to have these things in your story in order for them to be a story. You have to have these things in your crime story, or it's not a crime story. However, these are the places where you can innovate and make your story unique and stand out from the crowd. So how do you do that? You have to know your genre really, really well. This is how you ensure that you can put all the conventions in your story without it becoming cliché, formulaic, or predictable. And the way you do that is by studying the books in your genre. So here's what I recommend for homework. Make a spreadsheet. At the top, put all the different conventions that go into the genre that you're writing in. Then down the left column, list out different movies and books that you're a fan of inside of your genre. And then go through each one and identify each of these conventions and fill out your spreadsheet. Do this for at least 10 different books and movies. I recommend going up to 20. And then you will have this great database of all these different ways other writers have solved these genre conventions, and it will help you think of your own unique and innovative ways to do it. Genre conventions are one of those lovely tools that will ensure that you write a story that works. If you study your genre, you identify the conventions, and then you make sure those conventions are inside your story in new and innovative ways, this is why readers are going to love your story. But of course, while conventions are a must-have for your story, There's a lot that goes into writing a story that works. So make sure you subscribe to this channel, like this video, and hit that bell so you get notified of all the future videos we come out with. Also, as I mentioned, we put lots of resources down in the description of this video, but we have a lot more at storygrid.com. So go there, check out our books, sign up for the newsletter. That's where you hear about all the new things that we're doing at StoryGrid. And as always, thanks for being a writer. Thanks for being a part of our community here at StoryGrid, and I'll see you next time.